I had just pulled the last of my tomatoes from the garden when my phone rang. It was a neighbor's number, a woman 2 streets over named Patsy, someone I barely spoke to except to wave from the driveway. My stomach dropped before she even finished her first sentence. "I found your son," she said. "He's in my backyard. Something's wrong with him." I didn't grab my keys right away. I stood there in the kitchen with dirt still on my gloves, just trying to make my brain work. My son Walter is 41 years old. He is not the kind of man who ends up in a stranger's backyard. He coaches Little League in the spring. He drives a clean truck. He fixes things without being asked. Something being wrong with Walter felt like a sentence in a foreign language. I got there in 4 minutes. He was sitting against Patsy's fence with his head tipped back and his eyes half open. His lip was split. There was dried blood on his collar, his good blue collar, the one his wife Suzanne had bought him last Christmas. His right hand was swollen in a way that made me look away and then look back because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Walter. I knelt down in the wet grass. "Walter, look at me." He turned his head slowly. When his eyes found my face, something in him seemed to give way. Not relief exactly, more like exhaustion finally being allowed to exist. "She called Dad," he said. His voice was almost nothing. She called him and told him I was going to leave her. I didn't understand yet. I didn't know what any of it meant. I just held his face in both my hands the way I used to when he was small and running a fever, checking his eyes, checking that he was still him. "Who did this to you?" He closed his eyes. "Her father," he said, "and her brother. I need to tell you something about Suzanne's family before I go any further, because otherwise none of this makes sense. I tried for years to find the right feeling about them, not to like them. I gave up on that fairly early, but to find some neutral ground where I could stand without grinding my teeth every time her father Lawrence spoke. He was the kind of man who filled a room not with warmth, but with the awareness of himself. Everything he said had a frame around it. Every story he told ended with him being right. He had money from his father, who had money from his father, and at some point that accumulated wealth had curdled into the belief that it was a form of judgment, that having it meant you deserved it, and not having it meant something unflattering about your character. Walter grew up in this house, the house I bought with 22 years of night shifts at the hospital, working admissions, watching the clock, putting my son through school. We are not people who had it handed to us. We are people who earned it with our bodies and our sleep. Lawrence knew this about us. He considered it a mark against us. His wife, Suzanne's mother, was a small, careful woman named Greta who expressed her opinions through silence and strategic absence. She was never cruel directly. She simply wasn't there for anything that mattered. Suzanne's brother Philip had absorbed his father's worst qualities and none of his restraint. He was 37 and still asking Lawrence for money and still believing he deserved more of everything than he currently had. When Walter and Suzanne got married 8 years ago, I stood at that reception and made a decision. I told myself, you love your son. You will be polite. You will not make him choose. And for 8 years I kept that promise. I bit my tongue so many times I'm surprised I have one left. What I didn't know, what Walter had been carrying alone for most of those 8 years, was that Suzanne had never stopped choosing her father over her husband. Not in the ways that show, in the small, corrosive ways. She reported to Lawrence. She told him about Walter's salary, Walter's plans, Walter's frustrations. She let her father's opinions about our family sit at their dinner table like an uninvited guest she kept inviting back. And when Walter finally said he couldn't do it anymore, when he told Suzanne in private in their own bedroom that he thought they needed to separate, she picked up the phone and called her father. The emergency room doctor was a young woman who didn't waste words. 2 broken fingers on his right hand, a cracked rib on the left side, bruising across his back that she photographed and documented with the quiet efficiency of someone who has seen this before and knows exactly what it means legally. Walter didn't want to file a report. He sat on the examination table with his jaw set and said he just wanted to go home. "Where's home right now?" I asked him. He looked at the floor. That was how I found out he'd been staying in his truck for 3 days. Suzanne had changed the locks. His key didn't work. His clothes were in a garbage bag on the front porch, which her brother Philip had apparently found amusing enough to photograph and send to Walter with the caption, "I will not repeat here." I drove him to my house. I made him eat something. I sat across the table from him while he pushed food around his plate, and I asked him to tell me all of it, from the beginning, in whatever order it came out. It took 2 hours. When he finished, I sat very still for a moment. Outside the window, the sky had gone fully dark. The tomatoes were still on the counter where I'd left them. "Has she done this before?" I asked. "Called them when you argued?" He nodded. "And they've come to the house before?" "Twice," he said. "Nothing like this. Lawrence usually just shows up and talks at me until I agree with whatever point he's making. This time Philip came with him." He paused. "I told them I'd already talked to a lawyer. I understood then. That was the thing that changed the temperature. Not the separation itself. Lawrence could probably tolerate that, could frame it as Walter failing, Walter being inadequate. But a lawyer meant paperwork. A lawyer meant assets. A lawyer meant that the money Suzanne had inherited from her grandmother, money that had been sitting in a joint account for 6 years, might be something a court would have an opinion about. That was what the cracked rib was actually about. "My daughter lives in Portland now. Her name is Cecilia, and she is the most competent person I have ever known, which is saying something because I have known a lot of competent people in 40 years of hospital work. She is a paralegal. She has never been afraid of anything that I can identify." I called her at 10:30 that night. She picked up on the second ring. I heard her sit up in bed. I told her what had happened in the order it happened. Patsy's call, the backyard, the fence, the emergency room, the photographs the doctor had taken, the 3 nights in the truck, the garbage bag, the caption Philip had sent. Cecilia was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Don't let him minimize it tomorrow morning. He's going to wake up and want to make it smaller. Don't let him." "I know," I said. "Mom." Her voice changed slightly. "Are you okay?" I thought about that. "I'm very angry," I said, "but I'm fine." "Good," she said. "Stay angry. I'm getting on a plane." She arrived the next evening with a rolling carry-on and a yellow legal pad already covered in notes she'd made on the flight. She sat with Walter at the kitchen table for 3 hours. I made coffee and stayed nearby without hovering, the way I'd learned to do when they were teenagers and needed to talk to each other without their mother inserting herself into every sentence. What Cecilia had figured out, what she laid out on that yellow legal pad with her careful handwriting, was this. The joint account with Suzanne's inheritance was not the only financial issue. Walter had been listed on a small business loan Suzanne had taken out 18 months ago, a business that, as far as Walter knew, had never actually opened. He had signed the paperwork because she'd asked him to, and he trusted her. The way you trust your spouse. The way you assume that the person sleeping beside you for 8 years is not building something behind a wall you can't see. The loan was for $60,000. The business address on the paperwork was Lawrence's second property. Walter looked at my daughter across the table with an expression I recognized from when he was 9 years old and had just understood something he wished he hadn't. She was giving him money, he said. It wasn't a question. Cecilia nodded slowly. It looks that way. We need a real attorney, not just a paralegal. But from what you've described, there's a case. For the loan, Walter said. For the loan, Walter said. For the assault, for the documentation of financial misconduct during the marriage. She tapped a legal pad. All of it goes together. I want to pause here and say something because I think it matters. I was not a perfect mother. I worked nights for years when Walter and Cecilia were young. I missed things. School plays, arguments, mornings. Their father left when Cecilia was 7 and Walter was 4, and I became the only thing holding the structure together, which meant that sometimes the structure was all I had energy for. I know there were gaps. I know Walter learned early to handle things quietly, to not bring his problems through the door in a way that would add to the weight already there. That's why he'd been sleeping in his truck. That's why he'd been carrying this for 3 days without calling me. When I understood that, really understood it, sitting in my kitchen at midnight after Cecilia had gone to bed, I went into the backyard by myself and stood there in the dark for a long time. Not crying exactly, something more like grief, with nowhere to put itself. I had taught my son to be self-sufficient. He had learned the lesson too well. I made a decision standing out there in the dark. Whatever came next, lawyers, hearings, whatever Lawrence and his money decided to do, I was going to be present for it. Entirely, visibly, unmovably present. No more biting my tongue. No more neutral ground. My son had been beaten in a stranger's backyard and left with nothing. And I was 63 years old with nothing left to be polite about. The attorney Cecilia found was a woman named, I'll call her Ms. J, because she asked not to be named specifically, who had been practicing family law for 22 years and had the kind of calm that doesn't come from never having seen bad things. It comes from having seen them and not been destroyed by them. She reviewed everything Walter brought, the emergency room documentation, the photographs, the text Philip had sent, the loan paperwork, the business registration, the property records showing Lawrence's name. She looked up from the folder and said, "This is actually quite clear." Walter had been afraid, I think, that it wouldn't be. That somehow the weight of Lawrence's money would make the clear things murky. That's what money does to people who don't have it. It makes them doubt their own perception of obvious things. "The assault is criminal," Ms. J said. "That gets filed with the police. That's separate from my work. What I handle is the civil side. And what I see here is a pattern of financial control using marital assets." She paused. "Has he made any contact since the incident?" "Lawrence called twice," Walter said. "I didn't pick up." "Good. Don't." The police report took most of a Wednesday morning. I drove Walter to the station and sat in the waiting area while he spoke to a detective. There was a woman across from me with a child asleep across her lap, waiting for something I didn't know. And I sat with my hands folded and thought about all the years I'd smiled at Lawrence across holiday tables. All the times I'd said, "Fine. Thank you, everything's fine," when he asked how things were going in the flat tone of someone who didn't actually want to know. Walter came out of the back looking lighter. Not happy, but lighter. "They're going to interview Philip," he told me on the drive home. "The text he sent is apparently, the detective said, that's going to be useful." Philip had sent a photograph of Walter's garbage bag on the porch with a caption that contained a specific phrase about Walter's family, about where we came from, about what our name was worth. "I won't write it here, but the detective," Walter said, had highlighted it and circled it, and looked up from the paper with an expression that didn't require words. Some things reveal themselves when given the right light. Suzanne called 3 weeks later. Walter had moved back into the house by then. A locksmith and a letter from Miss J had taken care of that, and I was there helping him sort through some things when his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it for a long moment. "Do you want me to leave the room?" I asked. "No," he said. "Stay." He put it on speaker. I stood by the window and looked at the yard. Her voice was different than I expected. Not hard. Almost tentative. She said she wanted to explain that she hadn't known her father and Philip were going to do what they did. That she'd only told Lawrence about the separation because she was scared and didn't know what else to do. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared," he said, "when you signed the loan paperwork?" Silence. "Were you scared when you gave him the access codes to our account?" More silence. "Suzanne," he said, and his voice was very steady, "I spent 3 nights in my truck. I had a cracked rib. My mother found me in a neighbor's backyard." He paused. "I'm going to need you to stop calling this fear." He ended the call. I stood by the window and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said better. Lawrence hired an attorney, of course. A very expensive one who sent a series of letters using language designed to make the other side feel small and outmatched. Ms. J read each letter with the same expression, the calm one, the 22 years of this one, and wrote responses that were shorter and clearer and apparently infuriating to receive, judging by the pace at which the next letter always arrived. The criminal case moved on its own timeline, separate from the civil proceedings. Philip was charged. Lawrence was questioned as a witness. The loan paperwork and the property records were subpoenaed. I'm not going to give you a courtroom drama here, because that's not actually what happened. What happened was slower and less cinematic. Depositions, documents, waiting rooms, Walter taking days off work he couldn't really afford, Cecilia flying back twice more, covering her own flights, sleeping on my couch without complaining. What happened was that Lawrence's attorney, faced with the financial documentation Ms. J had assembled, recommended settlement. Walter called me from the parking lot outside Ms. J's office on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was in my garden, which is where I seem to be for every phone call that matters. It's done, he said. Tell me. He told me. The settlement covered the loan. It covered legal fees. It included a formal agreement that Lawrence and Philip would have no further contact with Walter, a provision Lawrence had apparently resisted until Miss J pointed out that a jury would be instructed to consider Philip's text message in its entirety as evidence of the family's character. After that, Lawrence had stopped resisting. Philip was convicted on the criminal charge. I won't tell you what the sentence was because honestly, I don't think about Philip very much anymore. I spent too many years giving that family space in my head that they didn't deserve, and I'm retired from that now. Walter is doing well. He moved into a smaller house on the east side of town, closer to the school where he coaches. He calls me on Sunday mornings, usually while he's making breakfast, and we talk about ordinary things. What I'm growing, what game his kids played badly that week, whether Cecilia's boyfriend is actually going to propose or just keep talking about it. He came over last month to fix my back gate, which had been dragging for 2 years. He worked on it for most of an afternoon while I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watched him. When he finished, he stood back and opened and closed it a few times, satisfied, the way he always is when something works the way it should. You know what I think about sometimes, he said, still looking at the gate. What? That you drove 4 minutes and found me and didn't ask me anything except who did it. He turned around. You didn't ask what I'd done or what had led up to it. You just asked who did it. I thought about that. You're my son, I said. I've known you for 41 years. I didn't need to ask what led up to it. He smiled. It's a good smile. It's always been a good smile, even when he was small and missing his front teeth. Cecilia says I need to go to therapy, he said. Cecilia is right, I said. She usually is. He laughed and I laughed, and the gate opened and closed perfectly, and the afternoon sat around us like something that had been repaired without our noticing exactly when. I want to say one last thing for anyone who might be listening to this and recognizing something in it. Not the specific facts, but the feeling. The feeling of watching someone you love accept less than they deserve because they learned too early that making things easier for everyone else was the safest way to be. I spent years being careful around people who didn't deserve my care. I called it keeping the peace. What it actually was, I think, was a kind of self-erasure I told myself was generosity. The peace I was keeping was not mine. It was theirs. When my son was sitting against that fence with his eyes half open, I didn't feel confused about what my job was anymore. There was nothing ambiguous about it. There are moments that burn away the non-essential, and that was one of them. My name is on this house. I bought it with night shifts and cold coffee and 22 years of showing up. My son was built in these rooms. Whatever comes through that door asking to diminish us is going to find out that we are not, in fact, diminishable. Some things you learn early. Some things take 63 years. Both kinds of knowing are real. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand philosophical way. Just the ordinary kind, the kind you see when you finally stop moving fast enough to look back at the shape of things. Lawrence didn't become the man who sent his son-in-law home in a garbage bag overnight. that was built slowly, over decades, out of money that was never questioned and a family that never pushed back. Every time someone said yes when they meant no, every time someone absorbed the insult and called it keeping the peace, all of that accumulated. It didn't disappear. It just moved underground and kept growing. What happened to Walter in that backyard was not a sudden eruption. It was the surface finally cracking under the weight of everything that had been pressed down for years. And Walter, my quiet, capable, self-sufficient son, had learned his own set of lessons, the ones I taught him without meaning to. I taught him to carry things alone. I taught him that adding to someone's burden was a form of failure. He learned it so thoroughly that he slept in his truck for 3 nights rather than knock on my door. That's not his flaw. That's mine, redirected through him. I have to live with knowing that. I also have to live with the fact that when I finally showed up, when Patsy called and I drove those 4 minutes, I didn't make it worse by making it about me. I just knelt in the wet grass and asked the one question that mattered. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself in advance. It's just what you do when the moment comes, built out of every quiet decision you made in the years before it. Cecilia flew home twice on her own money and slept on my couch without complaining. She had built that, not from any single choice, but from the accumulated habit of showing up, of doing the hard work without waiting to be asked, of becoming someone whose competence is available to the people she loves. Walter called her, and she sat up in bed on the second ring. That's not luck. That's what a person becomes when they decide, early and repeatedly, that their presence matters. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story is not a lesson exactly. It's more like an observation. The people who tried to make us small, Lawrence with his contempt, Philip with his photograph, Suzanne with her quiet reporting, none of them factored in what 63 years of honest work actually builds. They saw a woman who smiled at holiday dinners and assumed that was all there was. They mistook patience for weakness. They mistook my son's quietness for acceptance. What we had was not wealth. It was something harder to acquire and harder to take away. Walter fixed my gate last month with the same hands that signed paperwork in good faith and got broken for it. He stood back and opened and closed that gate with the satisfaction I recognized. The satisfaction of someone who knows how things are supposed to work and makes them work that way. That doesn't come from what you're given. It comes from what you build, year by year, in full view of yourself. Lawrence's money didn't protect him. Philip's cruelty didn't protect him. The only thing that actually holds, in the end, is what you genuinely earned. And you can't fake that, and you can't buy it, and you absolutely cannot take it from someone else by force. We are still here. The gate works perfectly. That's enough.